There are days that feel like standing beneath a sky of heavy grey, as if rain is about to come, but never quite does. The air feels dense, but nothing breaks. You go about your routine, not with resistance, but with a quiet detachment, as if your life continues around you rather than through you. It's not despair. It's not peace either. It's a kind of suspension where you are technically present, yet internally unreachable. You respond to messages. You prepare meals. You move through conversations when needed. The day plays out task by task without disruption. But beneath the activity, there's a stillness that doesn't feel restful. It feels like absence, not of thought but of feeling, not chaos but silence. You're not overwhelmed. You're not in pain. But you've stopped registering your own experience with the same depth you once did. You're performing the shape of your life, but the inner link to it has gone quiet. And while no crisis announces itself, something essential has withdrawn, not with drama, but with distance. You are not overwhelmed with sadness. You are not moved by joy. You are not animated by hope, nor are you afflicted by despair. You are simply proceeding, as if watching yourself perform slightly from afar. This condition often escapes definition. When acknowledged at all, it is typically subsumed under broader categories: burnout, depression, fatigue. But in many cases, what is actually occurring is more nuanced and more defensive in structure. Emotional numbness is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of too much unprocessed experience that the psyche has for the moment suspended in order to avoid psychic flooding. It is a form of internal triage where the deeper system withdraws from the front lines because it has no capacity left to engage safely. From the outside, this state rarely appears alarming. In fact, it often coincides with high levels of outward functionality. You continue fulfilling obligations, maintaining social ties, executing routines. But internally there is a dullness that no longer shifts, a muted rhythm in place of what once felt vital. This is not evidence of emotional inadequacy. It is a form of conservation. The body preserves energy. The mind lowers its thresholds. The emotional system, faced with prolonged overexertion or chronic dissonance, adjusts by reducing intensity, not because it has failed, but because it has absorbed more than it can metabolize. Over time, this results in a gradual disengagement from things that once brought meaning, not because they have ceased to matter, but because the internal bridge connecting you to them has thinned through repeated strain. The interior world becomes subdued, not in peaceful detachment, but in protective stillness. This form of disengagement can be difficult to articulate. You may not feel broken, but you may begin to feel strangely absent from your own experience, not in crisis, but not fully present either. Advice from others often emphasizes external reactivation, travel, goal setting, increased productivity. But what often goes unrecognized is that numbness does not resolve through stimulation. It resolves through the re-establishment of internal safety, through an environment in which the system no longer feels compelled to mute itself. The appropriate response is not acceleration, but observation. The appropriate question is not how to feel more, but what you once felt too deeply for the system to continue carrying. And so this is where we begin, not with optimism, not with solutions, but with the willingness to observe without performance. Because long before healing can begin, there must be recognition. You are not thriving. You are not in crisis. You are somewhere in between, suspended, withdrawn, waiting for a world in which it might once again be safe to return to feeling. Nietzsche did not write about emotional numbness using the terms we do today, yet he understood its essence more intimately than most modern thinkers. He saw it not as pathology or deficiency, but as a natural response to a collapse in inner orientation, a protective gesture of the psyche withdrawing from what no longer feels bearable. For Nietzsche, the modern self operates within a structure of inherited meaning. Most people do not construct their own values, but unconsciously perform those handed to them by culture, religion, family, and institutional authority. As long as this structure holds, even superficially, life feels navigable, not necessarily fulfilling, but at least ordered. It is only when the cracks begin to form in that scaffolding that a deeper silence emerges. When one begins to feel emotionally muted, detached, or disengaged, it is often the first signal that the internal narrative that once gave motion to life has lost its force. The experience may not present as dramatic or even consciously alarming. Daily obligations continue. Conversations happen. The outer performance remains intact. But something in the interior world has begun to shut down, not out of laziness or despair, but because the mind has determined it is no longer safe to continue feeling. Nietzsche described this stage not as depression, but as a descent, a slow and disorienting entry into what he called the abyss. This was not a metaphor for crisis or dysfunction, but a space between frameworks, a psychological territory where the old values have died, but new ones have not yet emerged. In this suspended space, feeling becomes difficult, not because one has become incapable of emotion, but because the emotional system no longer has reliable coordinates. What once stirred the heart now falls flat. What once mattered now passes by without registering. He warned that few can remain in this space for long. Most rush to fill the silence with borrowed beliefs, moral certainty, productivity, or ideology. Anything that can simulate orientation. But Nietzsche urged something more difficult. To resist the urge to replace and instead endure the absence long enough for something authentic to emerge, not from external instruction, but from within the individual psyche itself. In this framing, numbness is not a deficit to be corrected. It is a refusal to participate in falseness. It is the psyche's way of saying, I cannot continue under these terms. It is not an end state, but a threshold, one that must be faced without sedation or substitution if anything new is to be built on honest ground. The danger Nietzsche saw was not in the descent itself, but in the escape. The person who flees this quiet erosion too quickly tends to return to performance under new disguises. The outer roles may shift, now framed as progress, spirituality, or discipline, but the disconnection remains, buried and unresolved. There is a reason Nietzsche called those who withstand this space the creators. They are not the ones who cling to inherited maps, nor those who drown in despair. They are the ones who, in the absence of inherited certainty, begin to construct meaning slowly, patiently, and without illusion. Not because they were inspired, but because they were finally unable to pretend. In contemporary culture, the inability to feel is quickly pathologized. The moment a person reports emotional flatness, they are steered toward clinical labels: depression, anhedonia, disassociation, each suggesting a deficit within the individual. While these diagnoses may at times apply, they often obscure a deeper question. What is the system responding to, and why has withdrawal become necessary? Modern life offers very little understanding of functional emotional defense. It rewards energy, visibility, and self-expression, often without regard for their source or sustainability. In such an environment, numbness is seen not as wisdom or exhaustion, but as malfunction. When a person becomes emotionally detached, they are assumed to have failed to maintain wellness. The expectation is that aliveness must always be evident, that interest, motivation, enthusiasm, and emotional responsiveness are permanent features of a healthy self. This view is not only inaccurate, it is hostile to the reality of inner adaptation. Numbness is frequently misinterpreted as laziness, cynicism, or disengagement. In truth, it may be none of these. It may be the residue of prolonged vigilance. It may be the natural result of years spent performing under conditions that allowed little room for honest emotional processing. In many cases, it is not the signal of collapse, but of survival under quiet duress. Nietzsche's suspicion of cultural narratives applies here. He distrusted the moral frameworks that demanded constant productivity and outward coherence, because he understood that what passes for strength in society is often a refusal to acknowledge internal limits. The one who slows down, who feels less, who becomes quiet, this person is not necessarily malfunctioning. They may be the only one responding honestly to something that has stopped making sense. Yet this kind of honesty has no real category in public discourse. Emotional withdrawal is seen as problematic not because it is inherently dangerous, but because it is inconvenient. It disrupts expected roles. It disturbs the rhythm of social performance. And so it is labeled, and often medicated, not because it is misunderstood, but because it is unwelcomed. In reality, the person who feels nothing may be the one who has felt too much, too deeply for too long, without any reliable outlet. They are not rejecting life. They are pausing their participation in a version of it that has stopped allowing for genuine presence. What they need is not stimulation or correction. What they need is recognition that numbness is not the enemy of healing, but its precondition. Emotional numbness rarely arrives suddenly. More often, it is the final adaptation in a long history of quiet overstimulation, a system that has learned over time that feeling is costly. For many, the origin lies not in a singular trauma, but in the accumulation of small, repeated misattunements, environments where emotional expression was not met with understanding, where vulnerability triggered rejection, or where need was consistently too much for the people around them to hold. In such conditions, a child quickly learns that feeling openly invites consequences, ridicule, punishment, or the disorienting experience of being ignored. When this pattern persists, the psyche does not revolt. It adjusts. It begins to mute itself, gently at first, then more thoroughly. What begins as subtle self-restraint eventually becomes internalized inhibition. The child may appear easy, well-behaved, even unusually mature. But this is not maturity. It is management. It is the early architecture of numbness being built in real time. Nietzsche understood the danger of inherited morality, not just in the ethical sense, but in the psychic one. He warned that we often internalize the expectations of others so thoroughly that we begin to see self-abandonment as virtue. The quiet child, the composed teenager, the reliable adult, these are often celebrated by society, even as they lose contact with their inner world. Emotional compliance is mistaken for strength. Disconnection is praised as resilience, and beneath that praise, something essential begins to recede. For others, the withdrawal is less subtle. It may emerge from acute emotional overload, chronic stress, exposure to conflict, or emotional parentification. These individuals learn early that there is no space for their inner experience. They are pulled into the needs of others, forced into vigilance, or placed in roles they were never equipped to inhabit. In these cases, numbness becomes a necessary reduction of stimulus, a way of preventing the system from fragmenting under pressure. Still others experience numbness not as a result of obvious distress, but of emotional confusion. The world taught them to perform, to adjust, to succeed, but never to feel. Their emotional vocabulary remained undeveloped. Their inner world stayed private and unarticulated, and eventually it faded not because it was denied, but because it was never fully acknowledged to begin with. Across all these paths, the mechanism is the same. The mind constricts its emotional responsiveness in order to maintain functional adaptation. What begins as survival becomes default, and over time the person forgets that something was lost. The danger is not simply in the absence of feeling, it is in the normalization of that absence. The self becomes accustomed to living in a muted register, not because it is easier, but because at some point it was safer. This adaptation may be successful for years. It allows for achievement, independence, even a sense of stability. But it is not neutral. It exacts a price. Relationships begin to thin. Joy, once textured, becomes harder to register. The self begins to sense, even if faintly, that something essential is missing, though it cannot quite locate where or when it disappeared. Numbness, then, is not an isolated condition. It is the residue of an intelligent system that learned to survive by retreating. Its roots are in adaptation, not failure. And if one is to understand it, they must begin not with judgment, but with recognition. This quietness is not an enemy. It is the story of how you endured. Nietzsche warned that the greatest danger facing the modern individual was not chaos or pain, but anesthesia. The gradual numbing of one's inner world, not through violent rupture, but through silent accommodation, represented to him a deeper kind of loss. Not the loss of function, but the loss of contact with one's own vitality. He wrote, "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster." The quote is often misunderstood as a warning against aggression, but its meaning reaches further. Nietzsche was speaking about internal transformation, how prolonged exposure to what is intolerable can reshape the self in ways that are difficult to reverse. When one spends long enough suppressing pain, resisting feeling, enduring what must be endured without pause or protest, one risks becoming incapable of the very sensitivity that once made life meaningful. In this light, numbness is not a surface symptom. It is a structural shift. The individual who has become emotionally shut down is not simply in need of rest. They are operating with a diminished range of inner access, not because they lack feeling, but because feeling no longer feels usable. The cost is not always visible at first. The person may appear stable, even well-regulated. They may continue to function at high levels of responsibility and reliability. But over time, subtle signs begin to emerge. Relationships grow distant. Creative impulses fade. Experiences that once elicited joy now feel muted, abstract, or mechanical. The individual may not be suffering in the clinical sense. They may not identify as depressed or anxious, but they no longer recognize themselves in the life they inhabit. Nietzsche saw this as the slow erosion of agency. The person does not collapse. They drift. They replicate motions, uphold obligations, maintain appearances. But there is no longer a center from which these actions arise. The inner life has thinned, and with it, the sense that one's existence is personally authored. When pain is suppressed over time, it does not disappear. It becomes internal noise, a persistent hum beneath awareness that interferes with intimacy, with spontaneity, with the ability to respond genuinely to the world. Emotional shutdown is not neutral. It leaves the person alive but unreachable, present but not truly available to themselves or others. Nietzsche did not advocate for perpetual exposure to suffering. He understood that pain must be borne wisely, that the soul needs shelter as much as it needs challenge. But he also knew that when suffering is denied, when it is dulled, minimized, or disowned, it does not cease to shape us. It shapes us blindly. It determines the edges of our choices without our consent. This is the hidden cost of numbness. It creates a life that appears intact, yet lacks inner participation. And the longer it remains unacknowledged, the more difficult it becomes to retrieve what was sacrificed. Recovery is possible, but it begins with the recognition that something has been silenced, not to shame or repair it quickly, but to understand why it went quiet in the first place. Nietzsche's concern was not that people would suffer. It was that they would become anesthetized to their own suffering, and in doing so, lose the very tension that makes transformation possible. The return to feeling does not begin with inspiration. It begins with discomfort. Most people expect that recovering emotional aliveness will come with a sense of renewal, the warmth of joy, the pull of passion, the rediscovery of hope. But this is rarely how it unfolds. The first sensations that return are often unwelcome: grief, regret, irritability, rawness. The system, long silenced, does not resume with ease. It stirs unsteadily and not always gently. This is one of the reasons many remain numb. The absence of feeling, while unsettling, is often preferable to the flood of what has been waiting beneath it. When sensitivity returns, it does not do so selectively. Alongside longing comes sorrow. Alongside interest comes vulnerability. The emotional system does not allow re-entry into only the preferred aspects of experience. Nietzsche understood that awakening to life again requires passing through its weight. He did not speak in the language of emotional healing, but his insistence on self-honesty, on confrontation without illusion, applies precisely here. To regain the ability to feel is not to become expressive or emotionally open in a superficial sense. It is to allow what has been waiting to emerge, often unfiltered and not yet organized into meaning. For those who have lived in numbness for a long time, the reawakening of sensation can feel like destabilization. Tears may appear without a narrative. Frustration may surface without a clear cause. Moments of beauty may suddenly feel unbearable in their intimacy. These are not signs of regression. They are indicators that the self is beginning to regain access to its own interior life. This process cannot be forced and it cannot be bypassed. It must be witnessed. It must unfold in an environment where feeling is not punished with explanation or rushed toward resolution. The system must learn that it is now safe to register what it once had to suppress. And this safety is not external, it is internal. It comes from no longer needing to perform neutrality in order to survive. In Nietzsche's terms, this is the slow return to authorship, the moment when life begins to be experienced from within, rather than managed from without. He would not have spoken of emotional reintegration in therapeutic terms, but he would have recognized the movement, a return from borrowed values toward lived experience, even when that experience is difficult to hold. There is no clean path here. One does not move from numbness to wholeness in a single gesture. The process is uneven. There are days when feeling returns and days when it recedes. What matters is not constancy, but the willingness to remain in contact, to resist the impulse to shut down again when the weight of emotion becomes unpredictable. The return to feeling is not a return to performance. It is not about appearing engaged. It is about restoring the conditions under which emotion can be metabolized without distortion. That means making space for what was once avoided. That means allowing for slowness, for confusion, for the ambiguity that emotional life always carries. Nietzsche believed that truth does not arrive with comfort. It arrives with responsibility. And this responsibility includes the choice to feel again, not because it is easy, but because anything else leads only further away from oneself. Numbness is not a detour. It is part of the path. The system does not mute itself without reason. It withdraws when the conditions for participation are no longer bearable. And though the world may interpret that withdrawal as weakness or detachment, it is, in many cases, the most coherent response a person can make to incoherent demands. The work, if it can be called that, is not to force oneself back into engagement. It is to listen, to observe without immediately interpreting, to notice what arises when silence is no longer resisted. For some, that silence will contain sorrow. For others, it will reveal an exhaustion that has gone unspoken for years. And for many, it will carry no immediate content, only the sense that something important remains paused. Nietzsche did not romanticize this state, but he understood that the person who remains inward long enough to hear what the world has not allowed them to say is already moving toward reconstitution, not by repairing the self, but by reconstructing it with new terms. This reconstruction will not look dramatic. It will not be obvious to others. It will not come with applause. It will arrive in moments of unforced awareness, in the return of small preferences, quiet dislikes, unfamiliar impulses that feel like your own. These are not signs of recovery. They are signs of presence. To feel again is not to return to how things were. It is to begin responding in a way that is no longer managed by survival. The numbness fades not because you have willed it away, but because it is no longer needed. And what returns in its place may not be joy or certainty or peace, but it will be real. And that in time will be enough. If this presentation prompted you to reflect on yourself, please like this video, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming mental resets. We have an extensive journey ahead, and we are here to guide you as you begin your mindset transformation.